Yesterday in the high-profile Oath Keepers trial. Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes and the leader of the Florida chapter of the far-right group Kelly Meggs were both found guilty of seditious conspiracy in connection with the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. The seditious conspiracy charge carries a maximum of 20 years in prison. Rhodes' attorney said they plan to appeal the conviction. This is the most serious case to grow out of the Justice Department's sprawling investigation into the U.S. Capitol insurrection. The trial lasted 8 weeks, with the jury deliberating for 3 days. 3 other members of the group were found not guilty on seditious conspiracy. That charge, they include Jessica Watkins, Kenneth Harrelson, and Thomas Caldwell. All 5 were found guilty of obstruction of an official proceeding and aiding and abetting for their actions on January 6th. A sentencing date has not been set yet. Federal prosecutors allege the 5 defendants conspired to oppose the peaceful transfer of power from former President Donald Trump to President Joe Biden. Attorney General Merrick Garland released a statement praising the work of prosecutors and federal agents, affirming that the Justice Department is, quote, committed to holding accountable those criminally responsible for the assault on our democracy on January 6, 2021.
Elise Jordan, obviously not easy to get this charge. A big win.
Seditious conspiracy.
Seditious conspiracy. A big win for prosecutors and a big win for Americans who were shocked and outraged by what happened on January the 6th. And let me just say, a huge loss for those right-wing Trumpers, the Trumpiest of the right-wing Trumpers in the chattering classes that kept saying, oh, wait a second, it wasn't an insurrection. If it were an insurrection, these people would be charged and found guilty of seditious conspiracy. Well, they were, and here we are, and it was an insurrection, according to juries, unless they want to nullify juries now.
Well, and what you hear from a lot of Trump supporters who defend what happened on January 6th is that so many of the insurrectionists are being held now as political prisoners. Well, this goes to the very top of the operation, seditious conspiracy, which is a pretty heavy charge when you think about the gravity of what happened that day and the attempt to overturn the government. And so now going forward, what does this mean for all of the other men and women who were there that day and who breached police boundaries, who went into areas of the Capitol that they weren't supposed to go into? What does this mean now?
Let's turn to some of our reporters on this story. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, now on NBC News, and MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner, and NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley. Guys, good morning. Ryan, let me start with you. You've been covering this case so closely. Both of you were in the courtroom, actually, for most of this trial. So, Ryan, how did the verdicts that you saw yesterday and heard line up with what you expected?
I definitely was expecting Stewart Rhodes to catch the seditious conspiracy verdict. I think that, actually the split verdict here sort of goes to the credibility of the jury and of the verdict, because we've seen a lot of attacks on D.C. jurors in a lot of court filings from January 6 defendants saying that they're too biased, they're too left-leaning to handle these cases and decide them fairly. But, they didn't give DOJ everything they wanted here. They looked at the evidence, applied the facts and the evidence, and came up with this mixed verdict. Finding 2 individuals were guilty of seditious conspiracy, but that three of them weren't. And I just think it's a well-reasoned and logical verdict that really does show that, jurors took their duty here seriously and looked at what the judge instructed them to do, looked at the evidence that was available to them, and decided that there was enough evidence to find so a big win for DOJ here overall. And, seditious conspiracy is something that hasn't been seen in D.C. for decades, and it's been more than a decade decade since the last time the Justice Department tried this, and in that case they didn't succeed. So they took a big shot here, and I think that this is over at Main Justice at DOJ headquarters. I think they're chalking this one up to a win, and it's not great news necessarily for individuals who are still facing these seditious conspiracy charges, including other members of the Oath Keepers whose trial is coming up, as well as members of the Proud Boys who also are facing that charge and will be going to trial here in the coming weeks.
Glenn, the Oath Keepers, as you know, have compared themselves to the founding fathers fighting tyranny. They said this was their Bastille moment, comparing themselves to French revolutionaries. We know that they had weapons, huge caches of weapons at a Comfort Inn in Arlington, Virginia. In case it came to that, they'd have boats at the ready to go in. They were role-playing. They thought they were revolutionaries. What message does this verdict send to them?
Yeah, Willie, criminal trials are not supposed to be political endeavors. The question for the jury exclusively is whether the evidence introduced at trial proves the charged offenses beyond a reasonable doubt. And I will say the prosecutors did a pretty good job at keeping politics out of the trial. Rarely did you hear a prosecutor even utter the name Donald Trump. But then the head of the Oath Keepers and the lead defendant, Elmer Stewart Rhodes, took the stand and blew it all up. Now, it's rare for defendants to take the stand in, large federal prosecutions. I've had some of my defendants take the stand, which, was always a happy time for me because I got to cross-examine them. But when Rhodes took the stand very early on in his lengthy testimony, he said, and I quote, "The election was unconstitutional," said the disbarred Yale lawyer. And he also helpfully added that he is a constitutional expert. I don't think he won any points with the jury. But once he did that, Willie, he really put the big lie on trial. So ultimately, I view the jury's verdict not only as an affirmation that the evidence proved the guilt of these 5 defendants beyond a reasonable doubt, but it was a pretty direct rejection of the big lie itself. In short, I think the verdicts were a victory of law, the rule of law, over lawlessness, and a victory of facts over, alternative facts.
Hey, Glenn, it's Jonathan. This is certainly a watershed moment in the January 6th investigations and a rarity to have the seditious conspiracy charge and conviction. So let's talk sentencing. What could Stewart Rhodes face here?
So Rhodes and his top lieutenant, Kelly Meggs, who was also convicted of the lead charge, seditious conspiracy, are looking at between 20 and 30 years. Now, that's the statutory maximum. The guidelines may be lower, though in a case like this, the judge may actually feel compelled to go to the top of the guideline range. Now, the other defendants who were also convicted of serious federal felonies, including trying to obstruct the certification of Joe Biden's win, are facing more like 10 to 15 years. But I really think it's the fact of the conviction, Jonathan, that matters more than how many years, or in Rhodes and Meggs' case, how many decades they may end up spending in prison.
Ryan, Elise Jordan here. What big cases are you watching now with January 6 defendants?
There's a lot of them that churn through every day, but I would think that the biggest one right now, in addition to this additional Oath Keepers trial, is going to be the Proud Boys. And frankly, I think the Proud Boys case, from what we've seen so far, is even stronger in terms of pre-planning. So you might have a case where you have more Proud Boys potentially convicted of the seditious conspiracy charge than you did Oath Keepers. Because DOJ did get, before the Oath Keepers trial, 3 Oath Keepers defendants to plead guilty to that charge of seditious conspiracy. None of them actually testified during the trial, which was interesting. We did have a couple other Oath Keepers who pleaded guilty to less serious charges, who did testify during the trial. But in the Proud Boys case, you have so much evidence of pre-planning and an intent in terms of they were, dressed up sort of as Antifa, and they were wearing bands basically to try to identify themselves. They didn't want to be identified as Proud Boys on that day. And then you just have so much more physical violence from members of the Proud Boys than you did members of the Oath Keepers. In the case of the Oath Keepers, you really only had one of these individuals actually physically engage with officers, Jessica Watkins, who was tried in this first case. And she was admitted that she was in that crowd inside the Capitol pushing up against police officers. And in fact, when she took the stand, said, find me guilty of this count. And the jury did in terms of civil disorder. But, in the case of the Proud Boys, there's just a ton of evidence of pre-planning. And you also have them physically smashing those windows. The famous video that we see over and over again of someone taking a police shield and actually physically smashing out that window to the Capitol, that's going to be on display during that trial, as well as additional violence against police, along with a lot more violent rhetoric than we even saw in the Oath Keepers case.
All right, NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley and NBC News and MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner, thank you both for being on this morning. The virus measures are now reportedly being tracked down using the country's extensive surveillance system in an effort to prevent future demonstrations. The Wall Street Journal reports, quote, Chinese authorities appear to be preventing fresh protests from taking root by deploying large numbers of police at the sites of planned protests in major cities. On Tuesday, a planned protest in Shenzhen was canceled after large numbers of police turned up at several locations in the city, according to messages on social media reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. Similarly, protests on Monday were canceled in Beijing and Shanghai. The Journal goes on, quote, besides hundreds of millions of cameras, some equipped with facial recognition software that line city streets, the police also can access detailed mobile phone and social media data that shows people's locations at a given time. The rare acts of defiance began over the weekend in major cities across China as frustration over the country's zero COVID policy came to a head. We'll be watching that. Willie?
Meanwhile, as we mentioned, the Iranian team from the World Cup is bracing for what could be an unwelcome homecoming by the Islamic Republic after failing to advance in 6 World Cup appearances now. While the team did sing the country's national anthem ahead of yesterday's match, the display followed reports the players were threatened with imprisonment and torture if they did not, quote, behave after failing to sing the anthem during their opening match against England last week in protest. A win against the U.S. could have helped ease the prior transgression, perhaps, but a former CIA covert operations officer tells the New York Post Iranian players now are stuck in an untenable position, facing fines or even arrest once they arrive home as retaliation for their disloyalty and their failure to beat the United States, Joe.
God.
So this was a concern immediately. That's why we've said again and again it was an incredible act of courage for those Iranian players in that first game not to sing the national anthem, speaking out for the women of Iran, some of them being attacked in the street as we speak. They may now face the consequences when they head home.
It was terrible as I was watching the game. Obviously, I was cheering on Team USA. At the same time, you couldn't help but feel for these Iranian players who took. We go back to the '68 Olympics and the raised clenched fists in '68, and that was so courageous. You look at these players on the largest of the world stage, just like the '68 Olympics in Mexico City, not singing the national anthem with the regime that they know could kill them, jail them, torture them, kill their families, imprison their families, and it showed extraordinary courage. But yeah, it was difficult watching the Iranian players afterwards. It just because what they may face when they go home.
Joining us now, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Kareem Sajapur. He focuses on Iran and U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East, and very interested to hear your thoughts on, number one, what these Iranian players are facing, what you're hearing about what could happen to them and to their families, and what the geopolitical implications are of all this.
Thank you, Mika. That's a great question. I mean, first, this game took place against the backdrop of the largest national uprisings in Iran since the country's 1979 revolution. Over the last 3 months, nearly 19,000 Iranians have been imprisoned, nearly 500 Iranians have been killed. And remember, this is a regime whose identity is premised on anti-Americanism. Its official slogan is "Death to America." And it desperately wanted this propaganda victory against the United States, in many ways similar to how the Soviet Union desperately wanted propaganda victories against the United States. as you alluded to, it threatened the players that if they were to exhibit any acts of protest against the regime, their families would be in trouble, their assets would be confiscated. And in the end, it ended very badly for the regime because people in Iran actually cheered the United States victory. And I think this is a reminder, Mika, that despite the fact that this is the most anti-American regime in the world, it's arguably one of the most pro-American societies in the world.
You know, that's always been, I've talked to friends in the CIA who always said the great irony was that, this was a decade ago, but said in the countries that are our greatest geopolitical threats, people who consider the United States their enemy, they talk about Iran and at the time Syria. They said, when they were in Damascus or Tehran, actually, the people there loved Americans, couldn't ask enough questions about American society, where some of our allies actually have people who have an open hostility toward the United States, or at least did in the past. But can you talk about that? It's position when I'm watching Iran play and in past World Cups, because the government's the epicenter of international terrorism and has been since 1979. And yet the people, from everything I've heard, are wonderful. Most are pro-American. The culture, the civilization, the history, the heritage, there's just not a more remarkable civilization on earth than the Persian civilization. I've never been able to put those two realities together. How could it be that these thugs have captured such a vibrant, wonderful civilization for almost 50 years now?
Joe, you have two very powerful forces in Iran. You have a young, modern society which is desperately seeking wholesale fundamental change, and they have at their back a civilization that, as you talked about, is 2,500 years old, and they're very proud of that civilization, and they want to be an upstanding member of the international community. And then you have a regime which has been in power for 43 years, and it's ruthless, and that it believes that it's either rule or die. They have no friends in the world, and in contrast to the Shah's government in 1978, when many of the elite of the Shah's government were able to remake their lives in London or Los Angeles when the revolution happened, these guys are friendless. Their only friend is in Syria. And so these powerful forces are going to continue to play out in Iran. And there's no guarantee that people will prevail in the near term, but I think it's certainly guaranteed that this is a regime which is not sustainable.
So, Kareem, what changes things in Iran? I mean, I'm thinking back to the Green Revolution of 2009 and 2010, which was previously the largest demonstration we've seen inside the country since the revolution in '79. If everything you've just said is true, and Joe is right, that the country by and large is a young country and a modern country, wants to be a modern country, I should say. So what breaks the stranglehold that the small group of authoritarian leaders have on the rest of the population?
What we know from history, Willie, is that for popular uprisings to succeed, you not only need popular pressure from below, but importantly, you also need elite divisions at the top. And we've seen in Iran, obviously, an enormous desire for popular change. What we haven't yet seen are fissures at the top, those elite divisions. I have a friend who's a longtime professor in Tehran who told me about this regime. He said this regime are 20% idiots and 80% charlatans, meaning only 20% are true believers, truly believe in the ideology. But now, after 4 decades, 80% are charlatans. They don't believe in the ideology. They're in it for political and financial expediency. If these protests persist, I think you will start to see fissures, especially within that 80%.
Senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for...
I was just stunned. 61 to 36. I mean, I knew it was coming. I still couldn't believe it because our recent past politically would never suggested this would have happened in 2022. 2004, Republicans put gay marriage bans, same-sex marriage bans on initiatives in every swing state they could because they knew it would drive up vote and help them win the election. 4 years later, Barack Obama, as progressive of a president as we've had when he was running, Barack Obama said he was against same-sex marriage because he was a Christian and he believes marriage was between a man and a woman. 4 years later, in the 2012 campaign, just a decade ago, Joe Biden got absolutely crushed by the Obama White House. Was I remember in real time getting reports out of the White House that nobody would talk to him. He would go into meetings. He was dead man walking inside that White House because he dared to go on Meet the Press and say he supported same-sex marriage. Now think about that. That's just 10 years ago, right? And here we are, 61-36, when that vice president who was attacked inside a progressive administration for saying he supported same-sex marriage. And Arnie Duncan the next day, I think, came on Morning Joe, said he supported it too. Then he faced a firestorm when he went back to the White House. I say all that just to say, my God, 10 years later, it passes in a breeze. Bipartisan legislation. That's a pretty extraordinary decade.
Joe, what an example this issue is of how the American people are often farther ahead than politicians on human rights issues. And you look at where Vice President Joe Biden, then Vice President, where he was and how he was ahead of the politics within the Democratic establishment, but he could tell what the pulse of the voters was. And then you look at today and, you know, most Republicans are behind this. And it's just such a human rights triumph in America that this isn't even a point of debate, a point of contention anymore, really. But it's just, you look at the other issues that there still are outstanding, and we still have places to come. I wonder if women's health, though, is just another example of where politicians are out of step with where the voters are.
They got 12 Republicans to vote for this, John, to get over 60 votes. Still a whole bunch of them who did not vote for the federal protection of gay marriage. But when you look again at just over the last decade of where Barack Obama was, we had guests on our show 10 years ago. I know Joe mentioned this yesterday. Arnie Duncan was the education secretary. We asked him on the air, and it was seen as a big deal. He said, yeah, I support gay marriage. I think if people of the same sex want to marry, we should honor that. And it was like big breaking news. And if you look at the movement in the polls in the country, even among Republicans, it's now a vast majority position to respect and honor gay marriage in this country. Quite a movement in a decade.
Yeah, it's been argued there's been nothing that has moved so quickly in the public acceptance as the idea of gay marriage. This is okay. Same-sex marriage, of course, is fine, and the government should stay out of it. 12 Republicans, more than they anticipated they would get. There was sort of a triumphant mood in the Senate yesterday after this happened. It goes to the House next week, where it's expected, of course, to pass. And then President Biden has said he will happily sign it as soon as he possibly can. Biden, of course, as Joe just mentioned, ahead of many Democrats on this issue back when he was vice president. And this comes at a time of this was all taken up because of the Dobbs decision, because of the abortion rights being overturned. And there was a quick move to sort of to codify this, to protect this. It happened quickly. Proponents are really pleased, and we'll see the president sign it likely in the next week or so.
Just one of many agenda items on Capitol Hill this morning, including the House Democratic leadership elections, an expected vote to blocking a looming rail strike, and another attempt to avoid a government shutdown. Let's bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles. Ryan, a busy day. Looking forward to a busy week here.
Maybe a busy month, Willie. There's a lot that Congress has to get done over the next couple of days. But you're right. The headline today will be the historic election of a new crop of Democratic leaders led by New York City's Hakeem Jeffries, who will become the first African American to be the leader of any party on Capitol Hill, House or Senate, when he is expected to be unanimously elected by his peers in a closed-door vote this morning. He'll be joined by Catherine Clark of Massachusetts, who will serve as his deputy, and then Pete Aguilar of California will become the conference chair. Still hanging around, though, will be Jim Clyburn. Who is going to serve in a role in leadership. But what you see here, Willie, is truly a change, a generational change in leadership. This new crop, these three new leaders, are 30 years younger than the group that they're going to replace, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and James Clyburn in those top three spots. So this shows the Democratic Party evolving as they get to this next step. And of course, it will be a big job of Hakeem Jeffries to keep all these Democrats in line, given the fact that there will be such tight margins in the House of Representatives in the coming year, even though Democrats will be in the minority. And they have a lot to tackle right out of the gate. You mentioned this looming government shutdown. They have to decide whether or not they're going to pass a continuing resolution that essentially just kicks the can down the road, or if they will do some sort of fulsome omnibus spending plan that they can get both Democrats and Republicans to buy into. And then, of course, there is the rail strike, which is a big problem right now for the Biden administration. What they're going to deal with today is a bill that will essentially, approve the deal that they thought they already had with the unions and with the Biden administration and the rail companies. But they are also going to do a separate vote on offering paid sick leave to many of these rail workers. That's a key sticking point. It's something that progressives are strongly in support of. But they're going to do two separate votes in the House today so that they can get it over the finish line and then see if it has the votes to get done here in the Senate. So it is a very, very busy day here. Just an example of what we expect is going to take place over the next couple of weeks.
And Ryan, also the January 6th committee final report, any word on when that's going to come out and who else they still need to talk to in the short amount of time that they have?
Yeah, it's crazy how busy they still are, Mika. In fact, we reported for among the first to report that Robin Vos, who is the Assembly Speaker in Wisconsin, is scheduled to meet with the committee today. He, of course, was the leader in Wisconsin that got a phone call from Donald Trump 20 months after the election was certified, where Trump was demanding that he retroactively attempt to overturn the election results, and Vos turned him down, told him he couldn't do that. While Vos did have that profile and courage, he also spent somewhere in the range of $700,000 in taxpayer money to investigate the election in Wisconsin, and it turned up no examples of fraud. But to answer your question about when they're going to wrap this up, well, according to statute, they have to be done by December 31st. But Benny Thompson told reporters last night that they're getting closer, that they're almost ready to put their pens down on this final report, which he said will be 8 chapters in length. So it's going to have a ton of information. And keep in mind, Mika and Joe, they've been telling us from the very beginning that, yes, they're going to issue a report that kind of outlines everything, points to all the key things that they discovered, but they're also going to release all the information that they've compiled, every deposition, every piece of information that they've collected. Wow. So this is going to be just a trove of information, much of which we still don't know about, that this committee will ultimately release.
NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. Greatly appreciate it. So, Mika, I want to go back really quickly about Joe Biden and something that you've always said about how he gets politics. This guy from Delaware that's been underestimated his entire life, he gets politics. He was mocked, ridiculed, and just bluntly loathed by a progressive White House when he was too progressive for their tastes on marriage equality. You look back 2020, that presidential field for the Democratic nomination, he was mocked and ridiculed. He was too old. He was too senile. He was too moderate. There were all of these progressives that were they just looked down on him. They just flat out looked down on this guy. He won. He beat them all.
Yeah.
History has proven him to be right. It was the Obama White House that was wrong. I'm sure they're all embarrassed about how badly they treated Joe Biden 10 years ago for him being right on a civil rights issue. And all the things that were written about Joe Biden in the 2020 campaign, that he couldn't win, he wasn't up to it, he's too old. He beat everybody.
Well,
and then he beat Donald Trump. And then you look at what happened in 2022. Everybody's talking about red wave, red wave, red wave, except we weren't talking about a red wave. And he outplays everybody's expectations for him, it seems, just about every time.
He knows his politics. He knows the long game, and he knows how to walk through all the naysayers and all the underestimating and sort of put the blinders onto that and move forward. And whether, if you look at how he's handling Ukraine, which is just an unbelievably huge issue, it's masterful. If Americans were tuned into that, they're less so because of the division and issues that they face here at home and the economy. But at the midterms, again, he focused on abortion. He focused on democracy. He focused on abortion. He held a speech on the state of our democracy and the future of our democracy and restoring our democracy. He knew exactly what the touch points were, no matter what everybody else was saying.
And Willie, he was mocked and ridiculed. Biden was mocked and ridiculed for talking about democracy, talking about abortion. I won't mention the podcast, but I listened to a podcast the weekend before the election. The entire people that everybody here knows, the entire podcast was mocking and ridiculing Joe Biden for focusing on abortion and on democracy. He ended up being right. They all ended up being wrong.
Check the exit polls in Pennsylvania. Check the exit polls in Michigan. And he wasn't alone in believing that abortion was going to be a persistent issue, but a narrative sort of formed that, well, it was